Chapter 14. For the first time in her life, Cindy was at a loss for words. Ida must have had connections all over town, and Cindy felt completely defeated. She had no idea what she could do now. She knew her feelings for Caspian were real. Ida seemed to take Cindy's silence as encouragement to carry on. "So, this is what's going to happen now, my dear girl. The king is arranging another ball. Apparently, the prince picked the woman he wants to marry, and the king wants to celebrate in style. I've already spoken to Mr. Lowndes this morning, and he's going to visit us tomorrow evening. This marriage is going forward, Cindy, whether you like it or not. This is the only thing that will save our family's reputation. I'll become the rightful owner of your father's estate. And unless you want the king to find out about the stolen painting, or the fact that he ruined his reputation by getting involved with a prostitute, then you will obey me. Mr. Lowndes is going to take you to the ball, where you'll inform the king that you can't continue this affair because you're already engaged to a respectable man. This will teach you an extremely valuable life lesson. If you would have listened to me from the very beginning, maybe this wouldn't have to happen. Besides, the king isn't for you. A man like him needs a real woman, someone who will stand by him and support him. You're immature, stupid, and have a very shady past. He will suffer to see you with someone else. Now, I want you to get on with your duties. You've already wasted too much of my time today." Cindy's world was spinning out of control, and the tiny voice in her head was telling her this couldn't possibly be happening. She had no idea how, but her stepmother had found a way to completely crush her. Ida had proof and a witness. She could easily end up in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Caspian was the king. He wouldn't want to get involved with someone like her once he learned the whole truth, her past, and everything that entailed. What was she to do? A slow rush of fury inched through her veins. She wanted to scratch her stepmother's eyes out, but she didn't want to make her situation even more complicated than it already was. She was either going to lose her father's estate or Caspian. Ida had completely trapped her, and it seemed as if now Cindy had no other choice but to marry that idiot Lowndes. Red was wrong. Nothing was going to end well for her. The king was a vampire, but she was prepared to look past that. She wanted him, and her stepmother was wrong. She had the strength inside of her to become the Queen of Farrington. "Yes, stepmother," she finally said in the end, and left the room, feeling utterly wiped out and furious with herself for losing this battle. Cindy's thoughts were racing as she went to feed the chickens later on. Her stepmother had achieved exactly what she'd wanted by paying someone to steal the king's most valuable painting and placing the blame on her. The fact remained, Ida had access to her father's money, not Cindy, and she was resourceful. Someone must have seen her with Martha last night, but Cindy had no idea who might have wished for her to fail. Nearly everyone in town had gone to the ball. She didn't believe for a moment that one of Martha's girls would have betrayed her in such a manner. She knew she was strong, but she had no other plans set in motion, nothing to stop her stepmother's devious plots against her. She never thought she would be forced into marriage with a man who only wanted to use her as his farmhand and bed warmer. The king had sent his guards to search for her, and tomorrow she would have to face him again, hand in hand with another man. She hadn't lied to him when he'd asked her if there was another man in her life. Lowndes had never been relevant. Until today, she had everything under control. Her stepsisters laughed as she worked, but once she gave them an angry, fury-filled stare, they escaped into the house. At least they were still frightened of her. That, at least, made her feel somewhat better. Cindy clenched her fists and carried on with her usual duties, ignoring their taunts as best as she could. Rage filled her veins, and tears of frustration built in her eyes, but she refused to allow those wretched cows to see her cry. She would never let Ida know she'd finally broken her. Everything was falling apart, and her dream of being an independent artist in the future was gone forever. Her stepmother hadn't said another word to her since their confrontation, and Cindy finished her housekeeping duties by midnight. She was exhausted when she finally climbed into bed, but couldn't sleep yet again. She was staring at the king's favourite painting. She was even considering taking it back to the castle, but it carried a huge risk. General Davies wouldn't hesitate to arrest her again, so she needed to consider another method in which to return it to the castle. Ida had somehow found a witness, which was still inconceivable, and Cindy had run away from Caspian's chamber. No one could account for her whereabouts afterward. Londas. Cindy still had no idea what his first name was, and at that point she wasn't even bothered, nor did she care. She was attempting to come up with a new plan, but perhaps it was fate's way of saying she didn't deserve anything better. She'd ruined her chances when she'd gotten involved with Tom, but how long should she truly have to pay the price for something she'd done so long ago? The thought of it all exhausted her to no end. At some point late in the night, she managed to drift off to sleep, dreaming about her wedding with the Vampire King. The next day, she considered running away from Ida and her stepsisters, but she knew that she had nothing but the clothes on her back. Everything that her father had left to her, money, jewelry, and some old antiques, were under Ida's careful watch, and she highly doubted she could get away with taking back what was rightly hers, with her stepmother guarding it like a hawk. She had no desire to end up in prison again. Cindy knew her stepmother was a conniving woman, a liar, and she'd do anything to further her status in the kingdom. In the evening, when Cindy saw Londas's carriage outside, she went to her room. Susan showed up a few minutes later, barking at her, telling her to get ready. Although Cindy wanted to punch her in the face, she had no other choice but to remove her red ball gown from her wardrobe and slip it on. Sunset was approaching as she entered the drawing room and saw Londas sitting with her stepmother. Nausea rolled through her stomach, although she told herself that she couldn't act out of character in front of them. However, it would serve them right if she did indeed vomit on their shoes. Teresa and Susan were staring at her with open jealousy as she strolled in, wearing the red ball gown Martha had gifted her in order to impress Prince Eric. Even Ida was surprised to see that Cindy had made such an effort. Londas kept staring at her cleavage, nearly drooling. Tonight he looked as equally unappealing as when she'd seen him the first time. The thought of him touching her made her sick. "Oh, there she is, Mr. Londas. Our Cindy," her stepmother announced, giving her a stern look. Cindy had to force herself not to snap. "You can ride with your future husband in his carriage." Cindy nodded. In a way, she was glad she didn't have to ride with her stepmother and stepsisters. She didn't want to listen to their ridicule or her stepmother's threats of blackmail. Teresa and Susan must have forgotten that Cindy looked more beautiful than they did, because now they were giggling to themselves, most likely happy that Cindy was so miserable. "You look delightful, but such an intense colour doesn't suit you at all, and it clashes with my suit," Londas commented, and Cindy sighed, ready to punch him as well. The king had complimented her dress multiple times. She'd wanted to look beautiful at the ball, but now she was absolutely done with this dress. The memories from the ball were painful enough. Obviously, Londas had no clue about the latest fashion, but either way, Cindy didn't care about his opinion. "I'm not changing, if that's what you're hinting at," she snapped at him as she stepped into the carriage. "You should be more obedient. I expect that from my wife," Londus said, spreading his legs in order to climb into his carriage. "We won't be attempting any balls or parties once we're married." Cindy believed he was a fool if he thought for even a second that he could keep her locked up at his farm. She was a human being, and even if she married him, she would do as she pleased. "And you're going to serve my bed whenever the need arises. It's a wife's duty to be obedient and spread her legs when her husband needs to be satisfied." Cindy's jaw dropped, and she instantly wanted to show him how truly obedient she was planning to be. She clenched her fists, breathing through her nose, telling herself that striking him would only make her situation worse. She couldn't believe that Londus dared say something so disgusting and disrespectful to her. It appeared as if she wasn't only going to be his farm worker, but a sex slave as well. Somehow she managed to restrain herself and didn't say another word to him the entire time they were riding together. However, Londus was yapping all the way to the palace about his farm, his animals, and about how he imagined his new life with Cindy would be. By the time they arrived at the castle, Cindy was ready to strangle him. Her stomach was rumbling, and on top of that, Londus had terrible breath. She had no idea how she was going to get through this horrible confrontation with the king. Susan had mentioned that while she was in town today, everyone had been talking about her sparkling shoe. The king was still looking for her, and Cindy wasn't embarrassed at all that she'd spent the night with him. She felt that her dress was clinging to her back as she walked inside the castle alongside Londus. Every part of her body was aware that the king was nearby, but she wanted to avoid seeing him, knowing that it would break her apart. Ida was walking behind her, looking proud and holding her head high. For the first time since her father had passed away, she realized that she hated her stepmother with a vengeance. Telling the king that she was to marry someone else was going to hurt Cindy in the worst possible way. She had no doubt that Caspian would be devastated, and most likely furious that Cindy had lied to him. She desperately needed to find a way to tell him that she had no other choice, but she wasn't certain if this was even possible. Her stepmother and stepsisters were greeting other people from town. Cindy spotted Red in the distance, and she was surprised to see her with Charles again. Red had implied that she was prepared to end things with him, but Cindy had other things to worry about. She knew her friend couldn't help her in any way. She wanted to run as far as was physically possible, just so she could avoid being humiliated in front of the man she desired. "I don't like these kinds of parties, to be honest," Londus said as they entered the ballroom, "but your stepmother insisted that I accompany you here tonight. I hope we don't have to stay for too long. You shouldn't be staring at other men. You're going to be my wife soon enough." Cindy knew Caspian had organized the second ball, hoping she would attend. It was absolute torture for her to be there, standing on pins and needles, waiting for him to approach. Her stepsisters had already disappeared into the crowd, and Cindy was glad that she no longer had to listen to their silly conversation. She was seriously considering going to prison rather than staying in the castle a moment longer. "Cindy, go and fetch Mr. Londus a drink," Ida said, suddenly appearing next to her. She mumbled something that sounded close to, "Yes, stepmother," and then walked slowly toward the other side of the ballroom. Her stepmother could let the king know that she was engaged without her being there, but Cindy wasn't a coward. Her father had brought her up well, and she was always prepared to face difficult challenges. Caspian didn't know her well, but he should be able to sense that she was being forced into this marriage. Cindy told herself that it was time to end her pity party. She was strong, and there was a way out of this whole situation. She just had to figure it out. Then, a split second later, blazing heat scorched down to her core. She knew the king had found her in the crowd, because Cindy instantly sensed him. Parts of her body tingled, and sparks flew. No other man had ever made her feel as if she was completely losing her mind. and she wanted to press her burning body close to his. Vampire or not, he turned her sex into a pulsing wave ready to explode. He stood close, too close. Don't be afraid, my Cindy. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since we made love. That's why I threw this ball tonight, because I knew you would come back to me, whispered the enigmatic voice behind her, sending shudders of desire racing down her spine. She needed to close her eyes in order to calm down. Everything was happening entirely too fast. She didn't have time to think of what she was going to say to him. Something happened, and I can't be involved with you. Trust me, this will end badly for both of us, she said, not even thinking about the words as they left her lips. There was no way she could turn around and look directly into his eyes. Perhaps if she ignored him for a little while, he would leave her alone. His masculine scent was driving her wild, and all she could think of was touching him again. He placed his cold hand on her shoulder, and her insides began melting away. She gasped for air, remembering every word and every tune that had escaped through her mouth the night that she'd spent with him. What happened? We must talk right away. I owe you an explanation. He continued saying those soft words to her, making her forget where she was. You ran away so quickly, and I was losing hope, thinking that I'd never see you again, when my guards came back empty-handed. Heat was turning her blood into molten lava. This wasn't really happening. Her mind was in disarray. Pressure beneath her eyes was mounting. "Cindy, there you are. I was just looking for you," said another voice that instantly brought Cindy back to reality. Her heart practically stopped when she realized that her stepmother stood next to the king, and she'd dragged Londis along with her. Cindy's blood rushed to her ears, and anger swamped through her body like a firestorm. It was clear that Ida had been planning this from the moment she learned that Cindy had spent the night with the king. She was intentionally going to make Cindy look like a complete fool. Ida knew that the king would eventually show up, and no doubt planned to interrupt her at just the right moment so she could hurt her further. She might as well have stuck a knife in her back and twisted it a few times. "Your fiancé was just telling me how much he adores the castle," Ida said, smiling widely, and Cindy wished she could magically vanish. Her stepmother pretended that she hadn't even noticed the king standing beside her, and then methodically moved her gaze toward him. Cindy was too furious to react. Every bit of strength she had left her body, and she kept wishing for Martha to appear so she could make the king understand what was truly going on. "I'm sorry. I don't believe we have been properly introduced. I'm Ida, Cindy's stepmother, and this is her future husband, Mr. Londis." She pointed toward the disgusting idiot with a slight flourish of her hand, causing Cindy's stomach to tie itself into knots of nausea. The vampire king looked at Cindy, then glanced at Ida, finally moving his gaze toward Londis. The awkward silence moved between them for a long moment, and Cindy was ready to throw herself at her stepmother and throttle her. She finally looked up at the king, whose expression was stone-cold, unreadable, and her heart sank even further. "I'm King Caspian. Pleased to meet you," he finally said. "Our future husband. How can this be? I thought you mentioned that there wasn't any other man in your life, Cindy."